Go ahead and pick up 1 Corinthians chapter number 11. I was encouraged to just see so many pastors here that many of you I know, and it wasn't always that way, but over the years God has brought our paths together, and I just appreciate so many of you in this room. I love pastors and I love local churches. My life was changed in a local church. God called me in a local church. I met my wife in a local church. About every good thing God has given to me in this life, He gave me through the local church. So we want to just be prayerful for the men of God who pastor. You know, if you've never pastored a church before, you can think you know what it's like, but you really never know until you're really sitting in that seat. And there's so many things that pastors go through. They will share from the front very little really of all that happens behind the scenes. They're often attacked, but they do not have liberty to answer their accusers. And pastors just bear a lot of things. And I love the men of God. I thank God for those of you who are pastoring. It's good for everybody to have strong local churches. Missions would not do well without strong local churches. We need local churches. So God bless you. I pray that God would grow you, first of all, because very often God will grow the leader before He grows the church. He often grows you, and then the outworking of that is you see the church growing. And so pastors need to keep growing. I think they know that. We want to keep learning. So God bless you. Good to be here. I flew in from Thailand about 3 weeks ago. In fact, it was 3 weeks to the day. Flew in and we went up to Boise, Idaho. There was a conference up there. I flew in with my youngest son, Curtis. He's here tonight. And then on Friday, so just a couple of days ago, Joe flew in from Thailand. So Joe is here. He just got here. And Lord willing, we all leave in about 2 days. So we're going to get back to, where God would have us to be. And we appreciate the time here. You're always a blessing to us. But we also realize what God has given us to do over there. So we plan to head back. I went to Starbucks this morning because you have them. And it's so unusual to say, which Starbucks should we go to? And there'll be 4 or 5 that you can get to. This is just so unusual. And so, I said, which Starbucks shall we go to? And we went to one. And Joe, he weighs 116 pounds, which means that everything affects him double the way it affects you. So we went to Starbucks, and there was a big sign hanging on the door of the Starbucks, and it said, Nitro Brew. And Joe fatally said, "What is Nitro Brew?" And I said, I don't know. I kind of did, but I said, I don't know, but you should try it. And he said, "Are you sure?" I said, "No, it would be, try it." And so I said, "Curtis, get Joe a Nitro Brew." And so Joe had a Nitro Brew coffee. That was about 10 o'clock this morning. He's still bouncing tonight. Keeps sitting there and he keeps laughing for no reason. Just sits there and laughs. And so I hope you haven't ruined him. I hope he'll be okay when he gets back. But a lot of things here in America. 1 Corinthians chapter number 11. I have a message, I think, before the message. And I want to move pretty quickly. I knew we'd have introductions tonight. And just say something before the next preacher will come, and I'm waiting on that message, and I'm sure he'll be a blessing. I've heard so many good things. 1 Corinthians chapter number 11. Let's read, please, from verse 31. verse 31, it says, "For if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world." When I read that today, I prayed again, thank you, Lord, that I will not be condemned with the world. Because there is a condemnation, and we're thankful that in Christ we were delivered from that. Verse number 33, "Wherefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, tarry one for another. And if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that ye come not together unto condemnation." And this is where I want to take my thought from, the remainder of verse 34, which says, "And the rest will I set in order when I come." And the rest will I set in order when I come. If you were a member of the church at Corinth, you probably would have received a word that a letter had come from the Apostle Paul. It probably came in the form of a rolled up scroll, but it would have been quite an event to hear from the Apostle Paul. And I'm sure word went around that the Apostle Paul has written to us and call the members together and let us assemble ourselves and let's read aloud the letter from the Apostle and to see what it is that he would say to us. And I can imagine if everybody was sitting there as that scroll was unrolled and they began to read the words of the Apostle Paul, as we have here in 1 Corinthians, and they would have got to the part that we know as chapter 3. And imagine you were sitting there and they got to that part and you heard as the reader was reading it in chapter 3, for us, he would have said, "And there are divisions among you, and you're carnal." And perhaps if you were sitting there as a member and you heard that, you would feel, oh, maybe the room went quiet at that moment. And then as they began to read further on the letter that came to them, they got to the part that we would call chapter 5, and as they read, and then it was said from the letter that I've heard that there is fornication amongst you. And I can imagine that on top of hearing what was said previous, people would probably feel, oh. And then he read on again, and if you get to the part that we call chapter 11, then he begins to address another issue, the abuse of the Lord's Supper, and you're thinking, oh, another thing. And then he says this. He said in what we read in verse number 34, "And the rest will I set in order when I come." And you're thinking, there's more. There's more. Now I want to just point that verse out for this reason. I want you to see that Paul, and this is a pattern with God, Paul was saying, look, there is more, and there are some other things in this church and amongst some of you that will need to be attended to. But right now, I'm not going to tell you what those things are. I've told you enough already for you to know what it is I want you to do. And I'm going to suggest to you that therein is a pattern of God. That is the way that God works. God understands that it's possible to overwhelm you. God understands that if you get told too much at one time, there's two things can happen. Sometimes if you get told too much at one time, you simply cannot receive it. Your capacity is exhausted. Different people read the Bible different ways, and I don't have the best way, but I read the Bible until I get full. So once I hit something that God has given to me, and I feel moved and caused to meditate on that, I just have to stop, because if I keep going any further, then I will lose what I already have. Now, I'm not saying that you should do that, but it's just how it works for me. And when I teach in Thailand, we don't teach to set times. We teach until they're full. And so I have a duty to watch. And I have to be mindful of how much I'm going and what we're putting in, because you can get to the point that their capacity, they're full. They can't take any more. And if you just keep trying to force it upon them, at that point it will spill onto the ground. And so that can happen if you load it up too much. But it also can be that you can simply become overwhelmed by what God is showing you. And God understands that. Many times I've seen things with our children that I intend to address at a future time. But I choose that maybe now is not the time. Maybe enough has been said already. And this would not be wise to do this right now. And so he said, well, I've given you some things here to be mindful of, and the rest I will set in order when I come. But really what he's saying is this: just make a start with what God has shown you already. All right? I don't know if you've ever been to, sometimes you go to a conference, and I don't say this one is that way, but sometimes you go to a conference, and I know I've been many times, and I've been sitting there, and I go in there with great desire to learn, and I want to become better. And sometimes I hear so many things that what I become is the incredible shrinking pastor. And the more they teach, the more little I feel. And I can just feel entirely overwhelmed at all that I'm not doing. And I just believe that what God is saying to them, and what God would say to you tonight, is to just make a start with what God has shown you already. Just make a start with what God has said already. Jesus said in John chapter 16 and verse number 12, and this would add to the thought that God works this way too. Jesus said, I have yet many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. I do have much more, Pastor, that I will say to you about the ministry that I've put you over. I do have an intention to enlighten you to much more, but not right now. What I want you to do now is simply to act on what I've already shown you. And there's a principle there for every Christian. God progressively reveals his will to us. And what comes next is always connected with what came before. What comes next is always connected with what came before. So you can meet the next thing in the will of God by doing the present thing that God has asked you to do. And nobody misses the will of God. Nobody misses future blessings because of present obedience. If you just do what God has shown you already, if you just make a start, you might say, well, Sehmish, when I look at my life, there's so many things that probably are not as they should be. Well, just decide tonight that maybe you can't fix everything tonight, but you could make a start. Just decide as you think about the ministry that you lead, whether you're on a mission field or God has placed you over a local church, or you have another ministry, you're serving where you are. Maybe God will reveal something to you about what needs to be done at your place. And your place is a unique place. And you know your place is your place because that's where your people and you are. And there are some things that every local church has in common with another, there are some things we all do no matter where we are. So there are things I do in Thailand that you do here. I try to reach the lost, you do that also. I teach the Word of God, you do that also. I try to disciple people who get saved, you do that also. But there are some things that are also unique with our local churches. There is what we should do, and then there is the particular things that God has your place to do. And so your ministry in your place, and it's your job to discern this, is to connect with what God wants you to do in that place. All right, let me say that again. Much of what you do will be being done in every place. Right? Your ministry does not have to be different in everything. But there'll be some things that God will say, look, this is given to you folks to do. Over here, they're doing something else, but this is given to you to do. So God will just progressively reveal His will to you. You just make a start. Now, it also shows us that on occasions, God will hide some things from you. Yeah. I remember pastoring and I would find out some things sometimes, but when I found out about them, that wasn't when they were happening. Right. They'd often been happening a long time before that. But it's just that it wasn't God's timing to show me that. God did not deem it expedient, wise to reveal to me everything that was going on. And I thank God for that now. You know, when I was a kid, if my parents were talking, I tried everything. I used to put a glass up against it doesn't work. I used to put a glass up against the wall. I tried to hear that way. If I could get against the door, I always tried to hear what was going on. Let me just say that, the 3 decades in the ministry have changed me. Now I'm glad for everything I don't know. I thank God. And in fact, when people say, there's just something I want to tell you, I say, are you sure I need to know? Are you really sure I need to know this? And sometimes I'll deliberate and I'll say, you know what, that's not sure. Take it away. I don't want to know anymore. I don't want to know. Please, if I don't need to know, don't tell me. And so, there's some things that God will just keep from you for a period of time, and it'll get revealed to you progressively. Let me say this, and not everybody will understand this, but if you really love the Lord, and I believe you grow in love, I believe the more you journey with Him, I believe your love increases. And if you really love the Lord, as you reflect back on your past failures, you will feel quite grievous about that. You'll feel quite wounded. And God is temperate. There have been times I've sat and I've reflected on something I did. I remember after I got to Thailand, I pastored in Australia. God had blessed that ministry, but I got to Thailand and I'd probably been there a couple of years, and there's some challenges with our kids as they were getting to sort of older teens, and it dawned on me. I just realised then I don't think I was everything I should have been to the parents who had grown-up kids in our church, and I hadn't seen that before. And then I began to reflect on the faces of the people who used to sit out there. And I remember the heaviness of some who came into the church, their brokenness over the behaviour of one of their children or something that had happened. I never really understood it. And I remember really just crying about that. And I mean, I wasn't there anymore. But just crying about that. And I remember saying, God, I should have been better than that. God, I wasn't there like I should have been. I was good for the ones that had younger kids, but I should have been better. And, and it grieved me. But I just felt the Lord just say, Wayne, move on. Right. Move on. Yeah. If you stay at this place, you will get swallowed up by over too much grief. And you've seen it, and now you've learnt it, and you're wiser now, but you move on. You move on. And God is very merciful in how much is revealed to us and when it is revealed. And so God didn't tell these people everything, but He told them some things. And what you're supposed to do, your job, is to act upon what God has already shown you. That's what you're supposed to do. Now, I told you I've been here 3 weeks, and there's just something about coming here that is different to being in Thailand. And when I say that, I don't just mean the culture or the obvious visual things, but there's just something about when you come here, you don't feel you're in the same level of darkness. And if you haven't been to some of those places, you won't fully understand that. But you can feel it. And you come here, and a lot of that dissipates. And you can get a certain clarity in your thinking. And so just being here these past 3 weeks, God has said some things to me about our ministry in that place. And I've begun to think about that. And you say, what's your plan? Well, my plan is to just make a start. My plan is to go back and just try to do something that God has shown me to do. And that's what I'm saying you need to do. I'm saying if you leave here after this meeting, and there might be a lot of things swirling around, but if you leave here with a plan, look, I don't think I can fix everything in our family, but I certainly can make a start. I don't know I can address everything in our church, but God has shown me something, and I think I could make a start. And sometimes just the fear of the enormity of the task can cause some people a certain spiritual paralysis. And I think that's a little bit of what you see in Luke chapter 19 of the one who had his pound and kept it laid up in a napkin and said, I feed thee because thou art an austere man. Sometimes people can get overwhelmed, but it's not God overwhelming you. God is just asking you to make a start with the things that He showed you. Now what God will do, God will, like He did to the Corinthians, He will reveal to you the thing that you can do. That's what He's going to show you. All right, now there may be some other things that will come at a later point, and it could be that you can't do anything about that right now, or you're not ready to do anything about that. Oh, it might be some other reason He chooses to keep that He doesn't reveal it. But what He will reveal is what you can do right now. I find that unsaved people often stumble at that. Recently, just before Joe got here, he was able to lead a man to Christ who, by the way, happens to be the husband of the lady I told you, who is the big one. That's her husband. So he got saved about 2 to 3 weeks ago. Amen. And he's about age 40, so he got saved. But he was around us for a few months, but he kept saying, he'd say this to Joe, there's so many things in my life that aren't right. I've got to get them better before I can get saved. And I'm sure you've heard that. And sometimes unsaved people can stumble at that. The idea of, well, I'm too far gone. I believe my father used to think that. My father, as far as I know, died seemingly without Christ. But I remember my mother, I used to try every chance to invite my father and mother to church. And when my oldest son, Justin, was being baptised, in the early days of our ministry in Australia, I remember calling Mum and Dad, it's the grandkid, and saying, would you like to come? Justin's going to be baptised. And back then, it was the early days of that ministry I'd taken, and we used to baptise people in somebody's swimming pool. A neighbour had a swimming pool, which they would graciously agree to not swim in during the baptism. And we would go out there, and the church would surround the swimming pool and baptise there. So Mum and Dad came, and Dad sat through the message I preached, and I remember him sitting in the front row, and he had a certain discomfort, I think even about being in church, but he sat there alcohol had ravaged his life, and there seemed to be a lot of torments there from some things before. And he sat there through the service, and then he walked outside and he stood while we baptised my oldest son Justin, and that was that. They went home, but it was the next day. I was talking to my mum on the phone. She said, and she wasn't saved either, and she said, Wayne, your dad said something really strange last night. And I said, what did he say? She said, well, it was odd. He was sitting at his table that he would sit at. He had a beer, which is what he would do. And she said, I was sitting in the sofa and he was sitting at the table. And he said to me, I'm glad when Justin was baptised, I had my sunglasses on. And my mum said, well, that's a weird thing to say. What do you mean that you're glad you had your sunglasses on? And he said to her, well, I was weeping. I didn't want anyone to see. Now, my mum's unsaved. My mum said, what do you mean you're weeping? What were you weeping about? And he said, when I saw Justin being baptised, I wished that could have been me. Now, my dad just believed he was just too far gone. My dad just believed that there was no coming back where he was. And sometimes unsaved people can get caught with that, where they will not come to where the Lord wants them to be because they get overwhelmed with, and it's a lie and it's not true, and Jesus will take you just as you are if you'll just come. But they can think that. But sometimes Christian people too, in a different way, not about salvation, but they can feel so overwhelmed that they feel like there's so many things I cannot do, and because they cannot do many things, they will not do anything. And there's danger with that. And so the Lord was saying to these, look, just make a start with what you have. Just start with where you are. You just do what you know to do now. I was reading, since I've been here, I was reading about, I think he's famous, seems to be well known. He's dead now, but an American, and he was a botanist and a chemist, and his name was. You can see what that is. If you can't, I'll throw it to you after. All right. His name was George Carver. I was reading about George Carver. And George Carver was born a slave. He was born in 1864. I think Gettysburg would have been 63 or around that time. And so he was born a slave, but he was a Christian. And he studied in the day, chemistry, and died in the 1940s, chemistry and botany. And he just believed in God. And they said the only textbook that he had in his laboratory was the Bible. And so George Carver, he prayed, and he said, God, show me the universe. And he said, he said, I believe that God said to me, no, that's too much. It's too big. But I'll show you a peanut. I'll show you a peanut. And George Carver discovered things about peanuts that nobody ever knew. Now you can go research this yourself. But I was astounded. In fact, I did research it because I thought, how could this be so? But this man, God just revealed things to him, not the universe, not about everything, but just about something. And in fact, he discovered 300 uses for a peanut. And you say, I couldn't imagine that it'd be 300, right? I had to look myself. And he's credited with saving the economies of the South that at that time were tied to cotton farming. And cotton farming was just destroying, it's very heavy on the soil, it's very destructive. And so he found uses for 300 for the peanut, including, here we go, I won't read all 300, I've just got 200. soap, milk, animal feed. He found that a certain part of the peanut helped chickens to lay more eggs. Colouring and dyes from a peanut. Face cream, axle grease, insecticides, glue, medicines, charcoal, and many more. So God didn't show him the universe, but God showed him the peanut. And George Carver took what God showed him and he used that to great effect. Now, God is probably not going to show you everything, but he's probably already shown you some things. And what he was saying to these folks is to just take what I've shown you. He said, the rest I'll set in order when I come. And there's more, but you don't need to know that now. You just need to act now on what it is I've already shown you. Amen. You know what we need tonight? We don't need new revelation. We just need to be obedient to probably what God has already been saying. Just to act upon what God has already been saying. I believe that those who do that, who just will take a step and just go with what God has shown you. And I believe that we need to learn to rejoice in steps and not just in finish lines. That we need to be glad that maybe they're not at the end of it yet, but they're certainly not where they were before. And maybe your church is not everything that you hope it will be one day. But listen, thank God, it's a whole lot better than it used to be. I mean, God's done some things, and God's going to do a lot more, and God will reveal to you things. But I will tell you, it'll be done progressively. He will just show you step by step, because his interest is in you doing the things he's shown you, not just knowing the things he's shown you. So just take a step. Just take a step. Take a step in your own life. Just take a step. What's the next thing for you? What's the next thing that you can just say, well, I think it'd be time I could just do this. That's a good thing. Take a step in your marriage. Oh, Brother Sehmish, you don't know us. There's so many things. Well, there might be a lot of things, but is there something you could do now? Is there something you could do? Is there something you could do in your family? Is there something you could address in your ministry? Could you go back after this and say, I think we could do this? You know, there are probably other things we're going to have to do, but let's just take a step and make a start. And I believe that God had blessed that. Let's pray.